Hello everyone and welcome to this video. In this video we'll talk about the shadow. In particular we'll talk about why the shadow should be your friend. The shadow is probably one of the most well-known concepts from Jung, although I think it is commonly misunderstood to be something that it is not. The shadow, essentially as we'll conceptualize it, is part or a residue, let's say, of what we would call the ego. In this video we'll thus pass through a brief introductory section in which we'll conduct or concern ourselves with the structure of the psyche and Jungian psychoanalysis in general. We'll then talk about the shadow as the repressed. We'll then go on to talk about the shadow as your friend or as our friend and why we should work with it and integrate it. We'll finally talk about projection or the threats of the shadow. And we'll then talk about sort of practical, in the conclusion section, we'll talk about some practical advice on integrating the shadow and how to work with the shadow and stop projecting it all the time. So, before we start, let's sort of lay the groundwork here. Carl Jung was a psychoanalyst working at the turn of the 20th century as a student of Freud. Jung went beyond Freud's work, however, and sort of invented some new or proposed some new structural elements of the psyche, like the collective unconscious, the archetypes, and other concepts. Jung was not so much concerned with the personal aspects of the psyche as he was concerned with its sort of, let's say, greater context, the greater context in which it exists. The psyche, most fundamentally for Jung, is still divided, however, into what we call the ego and what we call the non-ego, so that which is not the ego. The ego essentially can be imagined as a fleshlight that you walk through the world with and point at things. This fleshlight has the interesting characteristic that it also explains you what it enlightens. So the ego doesn't only cast light on the elements that you encounter when walking through the world, but it also integrates them into a greater narrative, into sort of, let's say, a greater structure within which it helps you to point light at new elements that you may encounter while walking through the world subsequently. That is, I always say, the ego builds a continuous and coherent narrative of the world. The problem is that the world obviously isn't continuous and coherent. This is the fundamental problem of the ego. The second sort of component of this fundamental problem is that the ego can't put light or shed light on everything in the world. It necessarily creates shadow. Light, again, necessarily creates darkness. And precisely this darkness is what the shadow is concerned with. The shadow, thus, if we conceptualize it in very simple terms, is that which is cast into the darkness by the light of the ego. This relates the shadow quite concretely to a personal level. However, it is not limited to this personal level, obviously, as we'll come to discuss in a bit. The shadow, however, is that in the first place which the ego leaves in the gaps between the images it aligns in this sort of projected, coherent, and continuous structure that we call narrative. It is thus the sort of, let's say, metaphorical assumptions that it makes. Well, you know what I'm talking about. I'm a good guy, sometimes, but, this precise, the cutting off oneself, or let's say not finishing the sentence the way it was supposed to be finished, doesn't imply, or we would normally think it implies, oh yeah, well, he, she, they know what they wanted to say at the end of the sentence, but actually they don't, and this precise we don't know what we wanted to say is the lack of facing the shadow. So in the very simplest moment, the shadow is essentially that which we do not want to say to those who we talk to. Now, the shadow goes further than that because sometimes we omit things for social reasons and this would be part of sort of the persona, which I, by the way, made a video on. So if you're interested in learning more about the persona, then go check out my channel. And don't forget, by the way, to subscribe to the channel because we do share content on Jungian analysis and Jungian theory on a weekly basis that can be quite beneficial to understanding these kinds of issues, because there's a lot more to talk about when it comes to the shadow that I cannot cover in this introductory section. However, let's return to this now and look at this. So essentially, the shadow is not only that which you omit in the context of talking to me in a very specific moment, but it is precisely what you omit in the context of talking to yourself. So the shadow is essentially comprised of those things or those aspects of yourself you literally leave in the dark, you leave in the shadow. That which you do not want to see, that which you're scared of perhaps, but perhaps not even so much scared of, but perhaps disgusted by. The shadow in itself is, of course, not only comprised of the shadow, but for Jung, the shadow is comprised of many different sub-aspects. You may have the anima, or shadow components of the anima. You may have shadow components of your own personality. So if you say, for example, if you go on to sort of the shadow in the type theory of Jung, you may say that the shadow are those aspects of your personality that you haven't expressed fully. Type theory of Jung, for all those that are new to it, I've also made videos on this, so please go check out the channel. And again, don't forget to subscribe, because if there will be more videos coming up on this. Basically, Jung proposed a typology, a distinction between extroversion and introversion on the first level, and then on deeper levels, a distinction between types of cognitive action, essentially. So cognitive types: thinking, feeling, sensing, perceiving. Sensing, intuiting. And essentially, those types are expressed to different degrees within the psychology or the psychic makeup of people. So you may be a type that is more of an extroverted type. But for Jung, it is very clear and important that all types are expressed in all people, just to a lesser or greater degree. So that means if you're an extrovert, the shadow will be expressed, the shadow function within you will sort of be introversion. So this means, and this leads us to sort of this idea of integrating the shadow on a very fundamental level, that the gesture you're making essentially when integrating the shadow is moving towards a more integrated state of the personality. For Jung, as we recall, personality development is always about integratedness. It's always about integration. It's about wholeness. Now, on the level of the personality, that means if you're an extrovert, you may want to concern yourself with introverted activities. Or, to be put differently, introverted activities will be that which lays in your shadow. Now, the problem here is that it's very difficult, of course, for someone that is extroverted to concern themselves with introverted activities. You'll see this very often. Extroverts will run around doing all kinds of things and let's say, going from one social gathering to the next, jumping from one task to the next, and they never take the time to just be in, let's say, silence, reflection, and introspection, which is precisely what the introvert is concerned with, right? But more particularly, it becomes more interesting when you combine the functions. Let's say you're a type that is very concerned with extroverted thinking. That is a function that helps you with logic and manipulating elements in a logical manner in the external world. Now, this will mean that you have suppressed the opposing function, which is introverted feeling. Introverted feeling is essentially concerned with value building, with trying to look introspectively within yourself and ask yourself the question, why is something good? Why do that? Why do X, Y, Z? Now, the problematic aspect, or the reason why we should be concerned with this integration process, is essentially because the shadow is precisely the space where threat may arise on some levels. So this is true on multiple levels. So on the first level, it is obviously the weak point, right? It is the weak point of the personality in this case, but also the weak point of the wholeness of the psyche as such, right? If we say for example, within the shadow, there are repressed elements about our own potentiality for violence, then this violence, if it's not integrated, may spring up in a certain point unexpectedly, right? That is one element of the shadow, or one problematic of the shadow, that the elements within the shadow are as real as the elements in the ego. They are what we are, just as the ego is what we are, essentially. And this is, of course, questionable. Are we the ego? Are we the shadow? Are we us? Again, if you're interested in this kind of more philosophical debate, then go ahead and search the channel for videos that may be interesting for you. The problematic here is, however, that we always walk around the world and project those shadow elements upon others. So we'll go around and, for example, if we're concerned with our own violence, but we don't want to admit that, and we'll project this on, let's say, our neighbors or our spouse. And often you hear this in fights when two people have a fight, let's say spouse have a fight, and you say, well, you're this and that, you're such an irresponsible person. And basically what happens in this very moment is that I'm talking about myself. I'm saying, you're an irresponsible person. What I mean is, I am scared. I am an irresponsible person. Or perhaps I know I'm an irresponsible person. You see this in the workplace as well. Many times people will say, well, I had a friend, for example, tell me the other day that his boss said to him, oh, you're so unorganized and you're all over the place. You need to get yourself together a little more. And he was just stunned because he's not unorganized and he wasn't all over the place at all. He had everything straightened out. And now commonly you may react and say, well, okay, maybe I'll have to please the person and organize myself differently. And this may be a reaction appropriate in the work context. But the reflection I had with him was, oh, well, look, perhaps this is precisely her situation, right? And so this is a moment of projection, obviously, and it's a less threatening example. And we'll get to we'll talk about integration now and the question of why we should integrate. But we'll then in the sort of concluding section, we'll talk about the collective shadow and sort of threats for society, which I made a video on, and I'll continue to make another video on sort of the problematic of shadow suppression or repression at this very moment on a collective level. But let's get to sort of integration and the question why. So why is it interesting to even deal with the shadow? The answer here, I think, is pretty obvious from the discussions we had now. On the one hand, you create a more whole personality, a personality that is more rounded and balanced. On the other hand, the shadow is also the weak point of your sort of the chain that you've built in your psyche. Not only can you learn more about yourself, but you can become a person that is not so easily attacked, let's say. And by this I mean that the ego has built a narrative linear structure, continuous and coherent, as we put it. However, the structure has gaps, and those gaps are precisely what we would then call the shadow, or aspects of the shadow. And those gaps are precisely the points where the ego can be ruptured. That is, the ego can be punctured to a degree that the whole of it breaks down, its whole coherence breaks down. If one element that is fundamental to it and has been kept in that position for a long time is punctured at the right moment in time in a sort of constellation, the entire structure of the ego may break down. And so the more you manage to deal with those aspects in the shadows, the more of them will come to light and the stronger and firmer the ego will become. This doesn't mean you have to affirm all of them and say, well, I'm a violent person, I like violence, I like whatever. It doesn't mean that. It just means that you want to be aware of the presence of those elements within the whole. And now this gets us sort of to this question, okay, how do you integrate it and why and how do you do it? Well, I think to a large extent, this is about awareness. It's about recognizing and seeing the precise opposite of projecting and repressing. So the act of projecting essentially is you put something out there in order to sort of defend yourself from its presence in here. Now, the idea of integrating the shadow is to precisely recognize its position in here without necessarily saying, all I am is X, Y, Z, because that would be identification, right? So you want to integrate, but always recognize the balance. Yes, I am a violent person, but I'm also a very calm and nice person. And both of these elements have a position within my ego, within the structure of the whole. And I think this balanced and gesture of witnessing and seeing offers you a great possibility, a great inway into the recognition of yourself and learning about yourself in the outside world. Now, finally, and with this I'll conclude, the problem of the collective is, of course, a great problem in discussions of the shadow. And this problem of the collective essentially relates to the fact that the shadow for Jung is not only limited, as I said in the introduction, to the personal shadow, but also to the collective. As Jung says, the shadow spreads all the way down to hell. Now, what this of course means is that there are aspects of you that are not only limited to you, but that are sort of components of you that are collective, right? The trauma, the collective trauma of a society that has been at war for thousands of years. If you look at the European peoples, for example. The collective trauma of a society that has gone through genocide, if you look at the Jewish peoples, for example. And all of these traumas play a role in the possible responses that you may elicit. Because for Jung, we're connected to this whole through the collective unconscious. These contents may spring up, may be triggered if a certain archetype is constellated. This moment of constellation obviously always requires a moment of encountering something in the outside or on the inside. But the contents that have been accumulated around this archetype on the collective level remain present within the individual. And so it is important that you not only deal with your personal sort of shadow functions and aspects of the shadow, but also extrapolate this to sort of a more collective, a more sort of, let's say, the level of dealing with that which is beyond you. And I think this is also one of the purposes of this channel, is to sort of raise awareness, to be aware, right? To look, to see, and to recognize, to be a witness, a time witness, a witness of the time we're in. So if you like the work we're doing, then please consider to subscribe, recommend this to a friend, that would be great, and do leave a like. And if you have any comments, then please leave a comment below. Thanks a lot.